Hi students, I have a story I want to tell, and this story serves as instructions for every writing assignment you're ever going to have in my classes. It's a useful how-to as well as a little bit of a warning, but it's about how do you approach looking at and writing about television. Okay? And so this lesson applies to every assignment you're going to have, like I said. So you don't really need any explicit instructions. And when you don't have explicit instructions, this is what you do. You look at your fish. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk about textual analysis here. But how I'm going to do that is I'm going to tell you, paraphrase really, a story about the student in Agassiz. And this is going back to the 19th century. And what I'm talking about with this, I'm talking about the 19th century naturalist at Harvard, Louis Agassiz, not the tennis player from the 1990s, Andre Agassi, that you see pictured here. And Agassiz, like I said, he was a famous naturalist and prolific professor and writer at Harvard University. And the story goes that he had this eager student who showed up, can't wait to work and learn things from this great professor. And what Agassiz did is he said, okay, I want you to go and get this fish specimen and look at that fish. And then he left. So that student went and he probably got a jar that looked something like this, with this fish, old dead fish, been sitting in that jar for heaven knows how long. He took it out and he started looking at it. So the student sat there and he's a little perplexed because the professor just kind of disappeared, didn't give him any more instructions. He just said, look at that fish. And so the student sat there. He looked at it. He looked at it some more. He wondered, what the heck am I supposed to be looking at? You didn't tell me what to look at. So he didn't have any choice except to sit there and look. And then he started to draw it too. He started to draw what he saw there. He started to notice more. So the student filled up his day like this. Finally, the professor came back and he asked him, well, what is it like? What is that fish like? And the student told him a few things about it, some things that he had noted. And the professor said, yeah, well, that's pretty good, but that's not all. There's some more things. I want you to go look some more. And then he left. So the student said about this again. And the same thing happened the next day and the next day. There's a whole week of this, all right, where the student would look, he'd take notes, he'd see more things, and he'd talk to the professor about it, all right? And eventually, the student got to where he started making connections between these different observations that he had about that fish. He started seeing how there were these organs in similar places, and I don't know what other fish things you find. But the point was that he made connections between his observations. And with the professor's help, he started to connect these to more general laws, or at least hypotheses that we could say about that fish and about fish like it. Through his observations, he was able to make more meaningful statements through connections among those observations. And that's the lesson here, is that you engage in analysis by looking closely. You don't always know exactly what it is you're looking for. You just keep looking. And the more you look and you re-look, you're able to start making connections. And when you start making connections, then you have something to say. So, how is TV like a fish, you say? Well, it's very similar. We watch closely, we make connections, and then we elaborate on what those connections are. Whatever your assignment is in this paper, writing about, in our case, television, a television pilot, a television series, or even beyond that, we start by doing textual analysis. We look closely at an episode of TV, we make connections, and then we elaborate on what those connections are. And when we get to the point of actually writing a paper, we are essentially articulating an argument that describes those connections that we've made based on what we've seen. So we are presenting essentially factual evidence based on our observations. We aren't just saying what it is we feel or what we believe or what we think. We are making an argument based on factual evidence, and it's all grounded on our initial observations, us just looking at that text. If we're writing about a TV pilot, just looking at that TV pilot. So, the term for this, again, is textual analysis. It's an important tool as a critic. We have to be able to use textual analysis, but it's not the only tool. And we'll learn about those other tools and those other things that we can bring to bear throughout our class. But right now, as we get started, it's important that we really just start by focusing on the text and describing what we see and making those connections. As we go on, like I said, I'll offer you different ways to view that, different perspectives, different things to consider, right? But whatever we're doing, even when we're doing that, we're relying upon our own observations, our own expert critical observations that we make that aren't just thoughts that come out of air. They have basis in the things that we see. So this is textual analysis, and again, it's an important tool, but it's not the only tool. Sometimes we need to see the bigger picture. So think about this. What if Agassiz had encouraged his student to think about what surrounded the fish? Not just taking the fish out of the jar and just looking at the fish, but the alcohol in the jar itself, the laboratory in which he studied that fish, and even why was it that that particular fish got selected to be in that jar. You can imagine that this is essentially what we're trying to do when we expand our analysis to understand the object of study. We don't just look at the object itself, or in our case, the text itself. We start making connections beyond the text. And that's why textual analysis itself is not enough. In our class, when we say we study television culture, and not just television, this is what we mean. We look at the program, we look at the episode, but then we make connections outside of that. Sometimes it's to other episodes in the same series. Sometimes it's other series at the same time. Sometimes it's to series at other times in TV history. Sometimes it's to things that aren't even part of the television industry itself. Right? But we start by looking at our fish. We start by looking at our text, our program, and then we look outside the bounds of that program. And we see how television can be very, very meaningful in other ways too. So I've used some images from old TV ads here. They do a good job, I think, of distancing us from television culture by putting us in another time altogether, another culture altogether. And you can see here I've got the image on the TV, and then the advertisement that was promoting a particular way of thinking about TV. This is from the late 40s, and you can see they're encouraging people to see television as a family activity, and also it's promoting a particular kind of family as the ideal family scenario and what that would look like, and that television would be the source of happiness for that family if they could all gather around TV like that. This, again, is a difference between talking just about television and television culture, everything that surrounds us. For now, though, we can just relax and focus and think about that particular text that gets us started. And us as the experts, we are the person that we need to talk to, right? We are the one. We don't need other people because we have the power of observation and the power of textual analysis to say something meaningful about television.